There are more copies of the New Testament than any other document from the ancient world. There are also more differences between those copies than there are words in the entire text. Both of these facts are true, and together they tell a story that neither side wants you to hear in full. This is not a sermon, it's an investigation. Before you can ask whether the Bible is true, there's a prior question. Do we even know what it originally said? The New Testament was written by hand, copied by hand, and passed down through nearly 2,000 years of human error, intention, and care. So how much has it changed? The answer is more interesting and more honest than you've been told. Here's the problem: we don't have the originals. Not a single original manuscript of any New Testament book has survived. What we have are copies, copies of copies, copies of copies of copies, every one of them made by hand by scribes who sometimes misspelled words, skipped lines, or in rare cases changed the text on purpose. If you've heard someone say the Bible has been corrupted beyond recognition, this is the argument they're making. And it's not entirely wrong. Scribes did make mistakes, the text did change, but here's what most people don't realize: the same is true of every ancient text. We don't have the originals of Homer, Plato, Caesar, or Tacitus either. Every ancient document we possess is a copy of a copy. The question isn't whether copying introduces errors, it always does. The question is how much, and can we recover what was originally written? The discipline that answers this question is called textual criticism. It's not criticism in the sense of attacking the text, it's the scholarly method of comparing manuscripts to reconstruct the original wording. Scholars examine the age of a manuscript, its geographic origin, the quality of its scribal tradition, and the relationships between manuscript families. They weigh external evidence, which manuscripts are oldest and most reliable, against internal evidence, which reading best explains how the others arose. It's painstaking technical work, and it's been going on for over 300 years. Why does this matter? Because the New Testament makes extraordinary claims. A man rose from the dead. God became human. The entire trajectory of Western civilization was shaped by these texts. If the text has been fundamentally altered, if we can't know what the original authors wrote, then the foundation crumbles. But if the text has been reliably transmitted, then whatever you think about its claims, you're at least arguing about the right document. So let's look at the evidence. The New Testament exists in over 5,800 Greek manuscripts. That's just Greek. Add Latin translations and you get another 10,000. Add Syriac, Coptic, Armenian, Ethiopic and other languages, and the total exceeds 24,000 handwritten copies. To put that in perspective, we have roughly 10 copies of Caesar's Gallic Wars, about 8 copies of Thucydides' History, 7 copies of Plato. For most ancient texts, scholars work with a handful of manuscripts separated from the originals by 1,000 years or more. The New Testament has thousands of manuscripts, with the earliest fragments dating to within decades of the events they describe. Daniel Wallace, one of the world's leading textual critics, calls it an embarrassment of riches. No other ancient document comes close. Consider the comparison. The earliest biographies of Alexander the Great, Arrian and Plutarch, were written more than 300 years after his death. No historian doubts we know what they wrote. The earliest surviving manuscript of Caesar's Gallic Wars dates to roughly 900 years after Caesar. No classicist argues that we've lost Caesar's text. The earliest manuscript of Plato dates to over 1,300 years after Plato. And yet these texts are taught in every university in the world as reliable records of what their authors wrote. Now consider the New Testament. The earliest fragment, a scrap of papyrus called P52, containing a few verses from the Gospel of John, dates to approximately 125 CE. That's roughly 25 to 35 years after John was written. Found in Egypt, far from where the Gospel was likely composed. The text was already circulating across the Mediterranean within a generation. If we trust Caesar with 10 manuscripts and a 1,000-year gap, what do we do with a text that has 5,800 manuscripts and a gap of decades? And P52 is just the beginning. Papyrus 66, dating to around 200 CE, contains most of the Gospel of John, not a fragment, but a substantial codex. Papyrus 75, from roughly the same period, preserves extensive portions of Luke and John, and its text is remarkably close to Codex Vaticanus, a complete Bible produced over a century later. That's a critical finding. It means the text wasn't drifting wildly during the early centuries of copying. A manuscript from 200 CE and a manuscript from 350 CE contain essentially the same text. Then there are the great codices, Codex Sinaiticus, discovered in a monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai in 1844, dating to around 350 CE, the oldest complete New Testament. Codex Vaticanus, housed in the Vatican Library since at least 1475, dating to around 325 CE, widely considered the single most reliable New Testament manuscript. The picture that emerges is not of a text drifting further from its origins. It's of a text being confirmed, layer by layer, as we dig deeper into the past. But here's where it gets complicated. In 2005, Bart Ehrman, a former evangelical Christian turned agnostic, and one of the world's most prominent New Testament scholars, published a book called Misquoting Jesus. His central claim: there are approximately 400,000 textual variants among New Testament manuscripts, more differences than there are words in the entire text. That's not a fringe claim. Ehrman studied under Bruce Metzger at Princeton, the most respected textual critic of the 20th century. He knows the manuscripts, he's read the papyri, and his conclusion shook the faith of millions. The book became a New York Times bestseller, and for many readers it settled the question: the Bible has been hopelessly corrupted. 400,000 variants, the number is real. Ehrman didn't invent it. But what does it actually mean? Daniel Wallace, one of the world's leading textual critics and Ehrman's most prominent debate opponent, breaks it down. The counting works like this. If a single word is misspelled in 2,000 manuscripts, that counts as 2,000 variants, one error multiplied across every copy that contains it. The number is a function of having many manuscripts, not of having an unreliable text. As the 18th century scholar Richard Bentley observed, if we had only one manuscript of the New Testament, there would be 0 variants and 0 ability to detect errors. Wallace categorizes the variants into 4 groups. First, spelling differences and nonsense readings, about 70% of the total. A scribe writes John with 2 N's, a letter is transposed. These are the ancient equivalent of typos. Second, minor differences that don't affect translation, another 15 to 20%. Word order changes, the presence or absence of a definite article before a proper name. In Greek, you can say Christ Jesus or Jesus Christ. Both are grammatically correct, and the meaning is identical. Third, meaningful but not viable variants, about 9 to 10%. These are readings that would change the meaning if they were original, but no serious scholar believes they are. They're easily detected scribal errors from late, unreliable manuscripts. Fourth, and this is the critical category, variants that are both meaningful and viable. Readings that could change the meaning and have genuine manuscript support. This category accounts for less than 1% of all variants, roughly 1,400 out of 400,000. And what are these meaningful variants? The biggest ones are well known. The longer ending of Mark, 12 verses describing post-resurrection appearances that are absent from the earliest manuscripts. The story of the woman caught in adultery in John's Gospel, a beloved passage that doesn't appear in any manuscript before the 5th century. The comma Johanneum in 1 John, a Trinitarian formula found in no Greek manuscript before the 16th century. These are real textual questions. Serious scholars debate them, and modern Bibles flag them with footnotes. But here's what's remarkable: even these, the largest textual disputes in the entire New Testament, don't affect any core Christian doctrine. The resurrection is attested in dozens of undisputed passages. The divinity of Christ is established in texts no one questions. The ethical teachings of Jesus are preserved in manuscripts that agree. And here's the twist. Ehrman himself, the scholar whose book launched 1,000 doubts, acknowledges this. In the appendix of Misquoting Jesus, he writes, "Essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament." His own teacher, Bruce Metzger, the most influential textual critic of the 20th century, put it more directly: "The more I study the manuscripts and the more I look at the evidence, the more confident I am that we have essentially what the authors wrote." Teacher and student, same evidence, same training, different conclusions about faith, but on the reliability of the text itself, they agree more than they disagree. The manuscript evidence doesn't stop with the New Testament. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd stumbled into a cave near the Dead Sea and found a collection of scrolls that would transform biblical scholarship. Among them, the Great Isaiah Scroll, a complete copy of the Book of Isaiah, dating to approximately 150 BCE. Before this discovery, the oldest Hebrew manuscript of Isaiah dated to around 900 CE. That's a gap of over 1,000 years, a millennium of hand copying with no way to check for drift. When scholars finally compared the two texts, they found approximately 95% agreement. The 5% differences were overwhelmingly spelling variations, the ancient Hebrew equivalent of color versus color. 1,000 years of hand copying, and the text had been transmitted with extraordinary fidelity. Scholars call this the tenacity of the text, the principle that once a reading enters the manuscript tradition, it tends to persist. Variant readings are preserved, not lost. The original is almost certainly still there, somewhere in the tradition, waiting to be identified. So what does all of this prove? Let's be precise. It proves that the New Testament is the best attested document of antiquity, by a wide margin. It proves that the text was transmitted with remarkable care, though not with perfection. It proves that the vast majority of textual variants are trivial, and that the small number of meaningful variants don't affect any essential doctrine. And it proves that the Old Testament, too, was copied with a fidelity that surprised even the scholars who discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. What it doesn't prove, and this is important, is that the Bible is true. Manuscript evidence tells us what the authors wrote. It doesn't tell us whether what they wrote is historically accurate. Having 5,800 copies of a text proves the text was widely valued and carefully preserved. It doesn't prove the events it describes actually happened. Those are different questions, and they require different evidence. The manuscript tradition tells us we're reading the right document. Whether the document is right about reality is a question for archaeology, for eyewitness analysis, for historical corroboration. Different investigations entirely. Here's the honest position. The skeptic who says the Bible has been corrupted beyond recognition is wrong. The evidence doesn't support that claim, but the apologist who says the Bible has been perfectly preserved is also overstating the case. There are genuine textual questions, passages where we're not certain of the original wording. The truth is more interesting than either extreme. We have an extraordinarily well-preserved text. We have a small number of genuine uncertainties. And we have a scholarly discipline, textual criticism, that has spent 3 centuries developing rigorous methods to resolve them. The text is not perfect, but it is remarkably, demonstrably reliable, and both the leading skeptic and the leading defender of the text agree on that. We know what the text says, the manuscript evidence is clear on that, but knowing what a document says and knowing whether it's true are two very different things. Does the world the Bible describes actually exist? Are the places real? Are the people confirmed by independent sources? Does the ground match the page? In the next episode, we leave the library and go into the field to check the Bible against the archaeological record. We know what the text says. Now let's see if the world it describes holds up. The Bible is either the most carefully preserved document of the ancient world or a text corrupted beyond recovery. The evidence says it's the former, overwhelmingly, but preservation is not proof. Knowing what the authors wrote is only the beginning, because the real question was never whether we have the right text. The real question is whether the text is right. The investigation continues.